Hello and good evening, everyone. I am Priyanka and I am here to host the panel titled Inclusive Words for Women's Writers Fest by She the People. In this panel, we will be talking and discussing about all things queer, and we will be looking into the LGBTQIA plus community and the recent developments that have been happening in the field of law and in the field of activism. And to discuss with us today, we have Advocate Saurabh Kirpal, who is an advocate at the Supreme Court of India. He was also one of the counsels for the Navteej Johar case, the landmark case that decriminalized homosexuality in India in the year 2018. Along with Saurabh, we have Sonal Giani, who is a filmmaker, LGBTQI plus activist, and has been working in the field of activism for the last 1.5 decades. So, welcome Saurabh and welcome Sonal. And we are going to talk about all things queer. We are going to discuss about law and activism. And I would like to let our audience know that Saurabh has edited and also written this book called Sex and the Supreme Court. So, in this book, they have discussed landmark judgments concerning sex, the category of sex, and how the Supreme Court has been giving decisions with regards to this in the last few years. So, Saurabh, I want to start with you. My first question is towards you, and I want to read out something from the book which really struck me, and I want to know your thoughts on it. It says this book explores the relationship between the law, that is, the Constitution, the rights of an individual, and how these rights are enforced by the Supreme Court. So, this is how you start the book. So, I want to know your thoughts on what does this line mean to you?
First of all, thank you for having me on your in the seminar. Uh, I think this line actually encapsulates all that the Constitution guarantees and promises us. I think it harks back to the time of independence when there was a discussion which was happening in the Constituent Assembly as to what kind of future do we envisage for our country. We had freedom, yes, but there was a big discussion between individual rights and whether those should be protected or they should be community-based ideology without individual rights. Remember, this is the time when even the communism was an important philosophy. Uh, so ultimately, I think the constitution makers decided that a country like ours, which is so desperately poor, and at that point was even more so, but there was significant disadvantages to vast swathes of society, right? We today talk of LGBTQIA communities, but in 1950, I think the position of the Dalit community was even worse than the LGBT community today. So what the constitution makers thought was, let's try to empower an individual through giving them fundamental rights, an individual right, which they can then hold against the entire state. It's the right of that one person against the might of the state. But giving a right is not sufficient, you see. Having a right can be meaningless unless there's a place for you to go to enforce it. A right written on a piece of paper remains just that till you can actually go and go to an authority and say, this is my right, please make sure that this right is given to me. And for that, the constitution makers envisaged the Supreme Court really as the ultimate authority to guarantee freedoms to the individual and to protect the individual against majoritarianism and all kinds of oppression that might have otherwise impacted the rights of the individual. So I think really it was a case of a rights based approach coupled with a mechanism to enforce the rights. And the Constitution embodies these two. And that's why I think there's some kind of a trinity, a holy trinity that I'd like to talk about. Of course, whether that's happened or not is another matter of debate. Often the rights have proved chimerical. The Supreme Court has not always performed its task. There are lacunae, yes, but at least in terms of the architecture, the Supreme Court, the Constitution, and the rights, that's a very good architecture. The problem lies, I think, with the personnel manning the institutions.
I think you brought up some rather very interesting ideas that, rights without remedies could sometimes be meaningless. So, coming, sort of bringing this aspect, Sonal, I would like to ask you that, we we have reached a place where the LGBTQIA community today has rights that has been granted to them by the Supreme Court. Homosexuality has also been decriminalized. However, we're also at the same time, at the very grassroots or at the very social level, we're still fighting internalized homophobia, queerphobia, and transphobia, and also the same phobias that we get from the society as well. So, could you talk to us about this sort of internalization that occurs from within the community and from outside it?
Right. I mean, it was really nice to hear Saurabh and to also hear what all the court has been doing. But what is happening at the ground is what we are finding is that the reality of queer persons, regular queer persons, is like not much has really changed. For people coming out still seems to be just like it was when I hear people who are coming out in their 50s. So for those who are not, familiar with the term coming out basically means uh, telling somebody about your identity, right? And what we find is that usually when it comes to coming out, we have 6 stages roughly that you see that people are coming out. This is talking about an individual coming out because first the coming out has to happen at your own level. You need to kind of accept yourself. And then at the second stage, you would sort of come out to other people. And so for queer persons coming out, what usually happens is initially, when they might have some sense of confusion that, am I? And for some time, there might even be like a comparison where they will be in denial of their identity and they will observe around themselves, what is happening. And some people, the denial is so strong that for many years they continue to say that, they are not queer. Beyond that stage, or beyond this confusion and comparison, at some point you there will be a kind of tolerance which will develop, where you will begin to understand the identity, accept the identity, and eventually it will lead to a kind of acceptance. And with the acceptance, it will eventually turn to pride, and from pride it will become like a synthesis into your regular life. It will become part of your it will not it will be like, you will not think of it as something out of your life or something separate that needs to be talked out. It just becomes part of your life when you completely accept yourself. But for a lot of people to even kind of cross from this confusion comparison to even tolerance becomes really, really difficult, because what happens is around us, there isn't enough, resources available to tell us about our identities. What we find is that, mainstream media, the representation that is happening, um, there is hardly any representation. To this date, I find that, even despite the judgment happening, we still have characters which are used, just for the humor element in a series. And even if we have very positive stories, what we are finding is that very few really Indians, Indian identities. And within that, if we talk about identities of women, far lesser. And what we are finding is that the society is very patriarchal, women's sexuality is very, very policed. So what we actually need, actually, I would say primarily at the moment, is that we need more sensitizations to happen. And this is something mandated by the court as well, especially when it comes to police, because human rights violations are very, very high. They continue to be high even after the judgment. And what we find is that even our police force is not sensitized. And this becomes very difficult for us. The conditioning is so deep rooted and so strong that what we need to begin with is actually really familiarizing people with terms and what does it mean. Beyond that, institutional spaces should definitely, or unambiguously, very clearly have anti-discriminatory policies where it's spelled out clearly that there is zero tolerance for any kind of bullying, right? What we need is that institutions, they need to be coming out about their support. A lot of them expect queer persons to come out in a space which is not out about their support, which is very unfair. The spaces need to do this. We need to also have many more platforms where you allow queer persons to come on the table and speak about their experiences. If we don't have like a voice on the table, I mean, very little can change. And I feel that this also needs to happen even at a legal counsel level. We need to have more queer persons, openly out judges as well, you know.
Saurabh, I want to pick on something that Sonal said about, despite the many judgments, in fact, now coming from the Supreme Court, openly supporting gender identities and sexual orientations that do not align with heterosexuality or heteronormativity. Uh, how do we then envisage a law or legal systems which, even when there continues a gap continues to persist between what happens on ground versus the judgments, because the judgments show a completely different universe, whereas what continues to happen, the change at the ground level takes very long. So how do we then envisage the role of law within this space?
Well, you see, that is, I think, something to be expected. The court, when it gives a judgment, deals with the factual situation that is before it. It lays down the law, it lays down a moral precept, it explains the constitution. What it does not do is have a magic wand by which the deep rooted prejudices that Sonal was talking about earlier will just disappear, right? Uh, it's an example that I often give is the power of the law can be signaling thing. It will not by itself change anything. So, for instance, look in 1950 when the Constitution says that there will be no discrimination on the ground of sex, and there were judgments pretty much straight after in 1950, because it's clearly spelled out in the Constitution, unlike a right to sexuality or gender or the broader conception of sex. But 70 years later, the reality on the ground is that we're still a very deeply patriarchal society. And no amounts of judgments of the court will by themselves change things on the ground. You see, a judgment is only a tool to be used. It is one of the very many, I suppose, uh, activist tools that can be used. You go to court, you have to go to parliament, but more than anything else, I think it's important to have sensitization, a generation of empathy, knowledge. And for that, I think the real work has to be done by people on the ground and by activists. People like me who are lawyers, we come at a rather more superficial level uh, to remove the more obvious discriminations that exist in the law. But to have that translated on the ground, you see, is going to take more than just a declaration of principle by the Supreme Court. Because Supreme Court has neither the purse nor the sword. So they cannot enforce their own decisions. They simply lay down the law and they expect people to follow it. Now, often that happens because of the moral authority of the Constitution, the moral authority of the Supreme Court. People in our country still, in spite of all the discussions we may have, Twitter feeds, this, war, etc., they believe that the Supreme Court generally uh, holds in favor of the public, and if a judgment comes, they tend to obey it. But when a discrimination is so deep rooted, it's been there for generations and generations. Now we can go back as to when this hostility started, whether it's something in Hindu philosophy or whether it's a colonial mindset. Either way, we can all agree that it is a fairly old, deep-rooted prejudice that exists against the community. So to get rid of that, you need something far more than courts. And the question was, what can we do about the laws and how the laws can change it? I think just because a law cannot by itself change something doesn't mean we throw up our hands in the air and plead helplessness. We have to carry on pushing. We have to try to get a law, for instance, on, as Sonal was referring to earlier, on anti-discrimination. We need to have a comprehensive legislation which prohibits discrimination, not only on the grounds of sexuality and gender, but even on the grounds of sex. There is no such law in India. We need to have equal rights in every sphere. We need the court to stand up on a repeated basis. And I'll just wrap up with one thing. The closest parallel I can think of is the judgment of the US Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, which was a case dealing with segregation of schools between black children and white children. That judgment came, and the court found that in spite of their judgment saying that segregation between black and white people is unconstitutional, It didn't change anything on the ground. It took repeated interventions by the courts over 10 years, followed by the Civil Rights Act that was passed 15 years later, to actually start making a change. And even today, I think the situation of black people in the USA is not that equal to white people. Progress has been made, but progress is hard and it always has to be fought for. It's not something that comes easily, but we have to fight for it, and we have no option but to.
So, you said something very interesting that progress is very hard, and that's something that has to be fought because despite repeated interventions by the court, there is only so much change that can happen on the ground within a very short period of time. So, I would like to ask Sonal with regards to this. I was reading about your work, and in one of the places you have spoken about how you were outed without your consent, and even today. Queer people and their consent with regards to when and how they choose to come out is constantly violated because the people around us always have an assumption that they somehow have a say in our identity and how we navigate it. So, in terms of sort of trying to bridge the gap between the law that gives you rights versus queer people who are still having a very difficult time in sort of claiming those rights, how do we navigate this space when our personal spaces are so deeply compromised?
I very strongly believe that the change has to come in the hearts of people. Like what we do is at a mind level we do, but at a heart level it needs to come. And definitely this bit of outing people without consent. What is happening is that the right to a dignified life is kind of snatched away from you. Even my personal experience, in fact, when I was in my college and my workplace, I experienced very severe homophobia. Um, and there was no way of sort of addressing it. And forget about addressing it. Uh, for a majority of people like me, for that point, in that point of time, forget about addressing it. What ends up happening is you take on the guilt of having a particular identity because there is no support, around you. So what really needs to happen is that definitely at an institutional level, if you manage to get slip in an anti-discrimination policy, what needs to follow up with it is a sensitization, right? It's very important that this conversation sort of happens in classrooms or in these spaces where we are kind of cohabiting. And I mean, post that, you kind of create the space where people can kind of choose to come out depending on the response that has happened. It's very important to create an environment which feels safe instead of like a lot of times what I find is like people want LGBT people to be out at the workplace, but at a systemic level, at an administrative level, they have done nothing to make it friendly, for say trans employees foremost, but within their own culture also, nothing has kind of worked within there. So what happens is that one, of course, you need to this idea, right, that sex, gender, and sexuality is a spectrum is a very simple one, but it's very divorced to a lot of people's realities. But when you do kind of introduce it, I mean, I have found a lot of change because I've now worked across educational spaces and workspaces. What really works is that leaders in these spaces, the people who hold positions of power, they make their stand unambiguous and very clear. Besides that, it's very important to also give platforms to LGBTQ persons and personal stories. What I found is that policy and all is great. And I've been in my previous workplace, actually, in fact, in that time had a friendly policy, but I went through a lot of homophobia. But I think that sharing of personal stories really builds a lot of connect, when you can, understand the lived reality of someone and look at something through somebody's eyes, it really helps. One of the basic, differences that I find in the Western movement and in the Indian movement is that our relationships, basically we are a very familial society, very relational society. And so, if I want to really come out and truly live a open and dignified life, I need to come out to my entire family, right? In other cultures, what happens is that you sort of step out, step away from your family. But in case of India, it's different. And what we are finding is that a lot of people, they are not open. Their heart is not open to this conversation around LGBTQ, or they are not really thinking about it. at kind of a theory level, they may be thinking about it. But the minute your son or your daughter or your friend, your best friend comes out, the entire narrative and the entire understanding of the movement completely changes. And this is why it's part of the reason why, the LGBT movement in India, although it's 30 years old, if you look at it socially, there's far more acceptance than you would see in other countries, right? Because a bunch of us came out of these because of these judgments, and now it is our families also who had to, one way, which way or the other, accept it along with us, and which is why our movement is going to be, inherently different from what is happening in the West. And I feel that's what we need to do. If we give more platforms to people, we find that there are more role models, there are resources available. People make their support very open, unambiguous, and this is backed with policy and law. So in case there is a discrimination, we can take it up. Those are the things that really help. And I do think that after the Section 377 judgment coming out, it propelled a lot of people to come out, you know. मतलब हम में से कोई कभी कोर्ट जाने नहीं वाला है वैसे, right? Very few are actually going to go to the court, but the voice of Justice A.P. Shah, the stuff that was came out in the papers those days, even the Supreme Court verdict, it gives you, it offers you dignity, it gives you a voice, and I think that's what's important. And I've seen a huge social change even in just the last 2 years. It's just been exponential. Workplaces are now willing to do sensitizations. For some time between 2009 to 2018, they were like, the matter sub judice, we don't want to touch it. Now we have all the companies like kind of jumping in and saying that, oh, we want to do, which is a separate ball game. But yet, making your support open, it definitely changes things around you. And India society is changing much faster. You'll notice that.
You brought up some rather interesting aspects with regards to, having a zero tolerance policy in workspaces. And Saurabh, I want to ask this to you that uh, a lot of times anti-discrimination policy, whether a workspace will have it or not, depends on the employer, because we do not have a legislation which essentially brings private parties under the ambit of any kind of law that exists. So anti-discrimination policy always has to come from within the employer or within the organization or the structure in which people are inhabiting. So there seems to be a law gap there, in terms of that there needs to be a law or an anti-discrimination policy which actually brings employers under the ambit of anti-discrimination as well. So how do you think law can step in to ensure that fundamental rights that have been guaranteed are also transferred into the organizations that we work in?
In one very simple manner, the answer to your question is yes. Uh, do we need a law which prohibits anti-discrimination by private employers? Well, of course we do. The question, of course, the million dollar question is, how do we go about getting such a piece of legislation, right? And that is far more important to consider. Now, in India, the only two methods that through which you can have a legislation of this sort is either through Parliament making a law or through judicial intervention, right? There is no third way of bringing a law, mandating it. Now, as you said, of course, individual employers can always choose to have anti-discrimination law, and there is a lot to be said to mount social pressure on these companies to have such a anti-discrimination policy. And as Sonal said earlier, this is becoming more and more common, because it's when you have a anti-discrimination policy of this nature that employees also want to join your organization. It's something that employers can sell themselves as being a compassionate place to work with, and thereby attract the best talent. So yes, that's something that employers can do. But your question was more general than that. That what do we do in those instances where an employer does not have an anti-discrimination policy, right? So as I said, the only two ways are either through parliamentary intervention by way of legislation or by way of court, and the court giving its verdict. Now, as regards Parliament, to be honest, Priyanka, I don't see any hope of Parliament enacting legislation granting protection against discriminatory practices by private entities against LGBTQIA people. They haven't done so for women yet. They have not done for a host of religious minorities. And these are constituencies which are politically far more important to them than the LGBTQIA community. So therefore, I think Parliament is unlikely to step into it, because quite to the contrary of actually getting them some more votes, they perceive, now I think this may be wrong on their part, but they do perceive that acting in favor of the LGBTQ community might actually cost them votes, right? So, and this is what we saw in 2013 as well, when the Supreme Court said that had turned around, set aside the judgment of the Delhi High Court and said it's open to Parliament to legislate and repeal Section 377. Of course, that was an abdication on the part of the Supreme Court of its duty. It was a horrendous judgment. But be that as it may, they left it to Parliament. Yet, from 2013 to 2018, Parliament did not come forward and do even this minuscule act of decriminalizing homosexuality, right? So if they don't even bother doing that, I think any expectation that Parliament is going to step in is far-fetched. So the only hope really is to go to court and ask court to have some kind of a guideline where there are anti-discriminatory policies. There again, I'd say there are judges and their judges, their courts and their courts. There are 34 judges of the Supreme Court today, Priyanka, and I've discussed it with you previously. I'm sure we can draw 5 of those 34 judges who today would say that even the Navtej Johar judgment was wrong. So nothing is a guarantee even in the Supreme Court, because there are people come from all kinds of ideologies. These judges come from all kinds of places as well, and they're products of their own society. So nevertheless, the only hope we still have, actually, practically, is going to the court and seeking the court's intervention to set up some kind of anti-discrimination law. The Vishaka judgment came in 1997, and the Prevention of Sexual Harassment in the Workplace legislation came almost 18 years after that. But even the prevention of sexual harassment was a very limited area of intervention by the court in 97. What we need is a whole hog intervention by the court, laying down a more detailed equality code. And to do that, they can't simply rely on Article 14, which is the right to equality in the Constitution, because as you said in your opening comments, Article 14 and the right to equality in the Constitution applies to the relationship between a citizen and the state. The problem we have is a private employer. Nevertheless, the court does have powers under Article 142, which they have used in other instances. There are judicial tools available for them. All we need now are judges who are willing to do that.
So, you said some very interesting points, and I have a follow-up question. You said that if political parties started to speak of LGBTQIA plus rights, and have, say, bring in anti-discrimination policies from the parliament, it might hamper vote counts. But we have seen in recent times where political parties have instituted LGBTQIA plus friendly cells. How it's going to work, whether it's working, those are different questions, but at least on paper they're coming out and having it. So I'm just wondering whether, having a cell which at least on paper supports LGBTQIA plus rights in tandem with politics and political party is sort of a move to get friendly with a community that politically has always been against majoritarian politics.
Well, let me just unpack that for you. To say that the community has always been against majoritarian politics is possibly to misunderstand the community. Because I assure you, even within the LGBT community, there are a large number of, I shouldn't say bigots, but people who have a different view from necessarily supporting other minorities. So the intersectionalities that we need don't necessarily exist there. Let's just quickly disabuse ourselves of the idea that there is some kind of coherent, consolidated community which all thinks alike. Right? It's as fragmented as any other polity in the country, and it's only natural that it should be so. There's no reason that the queer community should be different from women, for instance. So you can't say women will inherently be anti-patriarchal. Quite to the contrary, you'll see that they've been subsumed within the system, and that it's like a Stockholm syndrome, and they started accepting and enjoying patriarchy. So I don't think that's leaving that aside. Uh, your question was about how political parties, whether they should have a cell. Well, of course, I believe that they should. But other than, say, the case of trans people in Tamil Nadu and maybe in certain other parts of South India, where there is a political impetus to support the trans rights or LGBTQI rights, I don't see the same movement in the political sphere elsewhere in the country. When you talk of LGBTQIA cells, yes, there are. I think we must talk to the elephant in the room. The biggest political party in the country and the dominant political force today is the BJP. And ultimately, till we convince them that it is in their interest or in the interest of the country or the community to have a legal, have a cell for LGBTQI community where they can have a dialectic or a discourse with the community. I think other parties, no matter even if they're national parties, they don't really make much of a practical difference, right? So I think, and also we can't shame the BJP into having a LGBTQI cell by saying that the CPI has it or the Congress has it. That's not how that party works, and that's not how many parties work. So I I wish they would do it. I know I think they're wrong when they think that they will lose votes when they fight for the cause of the queer community. Because I think Sonal is right. After the 2013 judgment and especially the 2018 judgment, society has changed very, very rapidly. And I don't think this is an issue that's going to lose them votes. It's certainly an issue that can gather them votes. I hope they realize it. But the way to make them change, and particularly the BJP, to make them understand and do something, is to make them aware as to how there is going to be an electoral benefit to them, right? And that's a job of a political party. I'm not saying passing any judgment about the BJP on this. I'm saying that it is a job of a political party to win elections, also of course to do the right thing and run the country and follow the constitution. But one of the very important things is to win elections. So we need to organize ourselves as a community and say that this is an electoral issue. So we will vote. Our allies will vote. And when I say allies, I don't mean family and friends. I mean other disadvantaged groups, form a cohesive bloc, and then it ought to be taken right. And then I'm sure something like that will propel political parties to address this.
It's very interesting that you spoke about that, even for we should not have the illusion that somehow uh, the entire community is one coherent community and that fragments exist. So, Sonal, my last question to you and for the panel as well is this that uh, we have come to know that there is a lot of gatekeeping that exists within the community and also from outside the community. So I would like to know, because you have been an activist for over 1.5 decades and you have experience of working with people on ground, how do we then understand the gatekeeping which happens from within the community and also outside of it?
Right. Gatekeeping is a very interesting term, and I think for different people, gatekeeping is meaning different things. And so I'm going to try to keep this brief, but I'll need to break it down also. So please be patient with me. One of the ways that we kind of look at gatekeeping is actually just physical gatekeeping and keeping people out of spaces, right? And this sometimes becomes, I mean, especially in the case of lesbian, bisexual women, it's a concern of safety as well. So not all gatekeeping is bad, right? So, for example, I'll tell you that Umang is a support group that I run. It's a Mumbai-based support group for lesbian, bisexual women and trans-masculine persons. And we have to ensure that the space is, devoid of, at least when the, closed meetings happen, it's devoid of cis men, because what happens is that because of the kind of social fabric that we have, they end up kind of, without even realizing, they kind of start shutting out voices, shutting down voices, mansplaining. And so a space meant to be safe for women then becomes like unsafe. Secondly, I've noticed that even if we not call them to a space, for example, we publicize our headline, and I'm just, because for the viewer to understand where this comes from, like we get a lot of calls on the helpline from men, who want to have access to a lesbian couple, or they want, they think because of the hypersexualization of the identity, they feel that, they can come in. Sometimes we also have women, by the way, wives who will call in to say for their husband and them, they, want to be part of this, whatever lesbian community is there. So because there isn't enough sensitization, in these spaces, it becomes very difficult. Plus, when you look at just the LBT movement itself, it's very important to understand that the LBT, and when I'm saying LBT, I mean transmasculine identities. The way that socializing happens or community mobilizing happens for LBT identities versus gay and trans people who are assigned male at birth is very different, because the people who've usually been assigned male at birth have a lot of access to public spaces, right? So if there are even HIV interventions, you can go into public spaces and you can access the community, which is not the case of LBT, like, or for lesbian women. I'm not going to go to a park and be able to identify very quickly, what could be. Usually, communities of lesbian, bisexual women will be, isolated. They will be units of their own, and we are, when they kind of reach out to us, we have to ensure that there is safety. A lot of women might come into a first meeting, and if they feel that the space is unsafe, they will never come back, right? And which is why you will find that even in support spaces, be it any support space except the pride, all LGBTQ support spaces, you will find that the population is very disproportionate. It's completely skewed towards cis men, gay men, right? So one of them is to, of course, ensure safety. That is why gatekeeping sort of becomes important. Secondly, sometimes you have to also gatekeep within community spaces, and we find a lot of allies saying, "Why don't you open the space, right? Can we not be a part of the pride? We would like to support," and all of that. But the thing is that they may be the most well-intentioned, but when they come into the space, they are not able to allow the platform to be, for queer persons, and they might. Suddenly the onus of taking the labor of understanding the identities again falls back on the LGBTQ person, right? And so this is a kind of emotional labor that we are putting in, which is really unfair. So, for our own mental health concerns as well as, safety primarily, gatekeeping is very important. But then there is another kind of gatekeeping that we find within the communities, which is a gatekeeping of the identity. Like who is the person who is going to be representative of this identity, right? And what we are finding in our communities is largely, this is English speaking, upper caste, cis men who will, talk about the movement. And in fact, for a lot of them, they don't see gender at all, right? They just don't see it. They're completely blind to it, and they are not willing to, acknowledge their privilege. And only when you acknowledge your privilege will you then, be able to make the space equitable for all, right? So there's a kind of gatekeeping of identities that we are having. And within that also, we find that if somebody is challenging this box also of, being gay or lesbian. So for example, I'm a bisexual woman, right? When I'll come into this identity, they will be like, "Oh, you are confused, right? You don't know, you have to take a side." For polyamorous people also, the same story, right? And which is why I keep saying this, right? Sometimes I find that even if you are part of the queer community, right, I find so many of them, right? So many of them, they might be in years of activism, they kind of mix up sex and gender, or they mix, they use gender and sexuality interchangeably. Which is why it's very important that we keep kind of refreshing people to these identities and ensure, that there are platforms for identities which are not, majoritarian. And that has to happen like constantly, working on your privilege, recognizing it, ensuring that there are platforms. Only that will change. My very, as an activist, I mean, this is my very huge complaint with the movement, because I mean, I have seen grassroots activists doing the kind of work which is like unbelievable, putting their heart and soul, going through police stations and supporting communities in smaller cities, right, where the violence is much more, than in smaller towns, villages, chances of violence are much higher. But when you see these listicles, right, you never see them mentioned. When you talk about academicians, listing the movement, what is the movement looking like? It will be predominantly voices of activists who are English speaking, right? And within that, you will not find voices of lesbian, bisexual women. Bisexual women, I mean, I am going to on this panel. It's an open challenge. Find me even five bisexual women, you know, who have been given a voice or for their work. It's difficult, and so that is the work we have to do from within ourselves, and we need to keep checking this gatekeeping. We need to keep ourselves updated. Just because we are part of the community doesn't mean that we understand it. It's very diverse, this identity, and in fact we should take this as a opportunity to learn more about identities and actually truly be open.
Thank you, Sonal. I think you brought up some rather interesting aspects with regards to gatekeeping, and we are going to close the panel now. And I think it's very important. And what I am taking away from this panel is that there is an institution that gives us hope, which is the Supreme Court, and it has been standing up for LGBTQIA plus rights for a really really long time, maybe starting 2009 with the Delhi High Court judgment as well, and culminating in many judgments that are also coming from various parts of high courts in India. So the courts are somewhat giving us hope while there is a lot of work that still needs to be done on ground. So I think it's just a really long journey that we'll have to undertake. So thank you, Saurabh, and thank you, Sonal, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and ideas. And the audience who is watching it, I highly recommend that you read this book. Sorry, that you
Yes.
read this book because I enjoyed reading it. And if you want to know what the Supreme Court has been talking about and discussing about with regards to sex, I think this is a book that needs to be picked up. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you in our next fest and around in Tree the People. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priyanka, for this, and
Thank you
Sonal for
so much.
making it
Thank you, sir.